Hello, beautiful people, and welcome! Hi, to the Xianyun pre-release analysis. It is finally time, and boy, is this one going to be interesting. I've seen a lot of discussion about Xianyun so far. I think that there's a very warped perception of her right now, so I am here to, I guess, shed some light into how good, how bad, how niche, how generic, how everything she is. So, Xianyun, or Cloud Retainer, is an Animo Catalyst user. Base stats, I talked a little bit in the Navia pre-release how base stats matter a little bit more now to me than they used to, mainly for HP and defense. But I don't think that matters as much on Xianyun, because as we're gonna see later, she is not an on-fielder. She's an off-fielder. She doesn't really stay on field for a very long time, which means that her relatively low HP and defense, all things considered, aren't really that big of a deal. But they are relatively low, so that can be something to keep in mind and can make her a bit vulnerable to dying when you swap into her. But again, right, it shouldn't be too big of a deal because she's not an on-fielder. Attack Ascension. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, very cool. Base attack 335, which is a bit on the higher side. Let's get into her talents. Let's talk about what she does. So we're gonna skip over the normal attacks because they're just normal Catalyst normal attacks, nothing special here. We're gonna talk about the skill. White Clouds at Dawn. Her skill is she jumps and then she plunges. That's it. She can jump up to 3 times before her plunge. But that's it. You can press the jump button, which is your E, up to 3 times to jump higher and to increase the damage of your plunge based on how many times you jump. That's what her skill does. That's it. Now, Burst. Elemental Burst Q, Stars Gather at Dusk. Brings forth a Sacred Breeze that deals AoE Animo damage and heals all nearby characters based on Xianyun's attack. It will also summon a mechanism known as, or named Star Wicker. Star Wicker continuously follows the active character and periodically heals all nearby characters based on Xianyun's attack. Now, if you look at characters like Kuki that only heals the active character, it specifies for active characters. Sayu's Burst, the initial cast, says heals all nearby party members, and it does work on the whole party. Sayu's Burst initial hit heals the whole party. And also from the footage I've seen, it looks like it's party-wide healing, but I just want to point out that it is technically somewhat ambiguous, so they could just change it without actually changing the wording. But it seems like it is all party members. Start with 8 stacks of Adeptal Assistance. While Adeptal Assistance is active, nearby characters will have their jump height increased. When the active character completes a plunge attack, you consume 1 stack of Adeptal Assistance to deal AoE Animo damage. So, in other words, you get healing over time, and you get to jump higher. And when you do plunge attacks, you get an Animo damage coordinated attack. We look at the numbers on this. The healing, I mean, the best comparison obviously is going to be to Jean, because she's also an attack scaling Animo healer. So it's a very, like, direct comparison that's easy to make. Jean's Burst initial hit at talent level 9 heals for 427% of her attack plus 3k, whereas Xianyun heals for 210 of her attack plus 1.5k. So it's about half. However, the continuous healing is AoE, whereas for Jean, the continuous healing is only single target. Overall, Xianyun's team healing should be a little bit higher than Jean, but it's not that big of a difference. The main thing to keep in mind is just that it's going to happen over time rather than all front loaded. If you look at the damage on the Star Wicker and the initial burst damage, right? 183 on the initial, 66 on the coordinated attack. Her skill, when you do triple E 500, when you do 1E 200, as we're gonna see later, generally you'll do 1E, not 3Es. So her personal damage is pretty dog shit, right? Like, it's 200 motion value here, another 200 here, and then technically up to like 500 and something with this. But in a lot of teams, you're not using all 8, so it's like less than 500. So it's less than 1,000 motion value in her whole kit in the average rotation. A little bit over if you do the triple E, but either way, like, it's not that much damage. So if that's all she did, right, and letting you jump higher, it wouldn't really do that much. Being able to jump higher is good, but what are you gonna do with that? Well, if you have to spend a party slot for her and all you're getting is jump damage, realistically what you're doing is kind of bad. But that is not all, right? Her first ascension passive gives you crit rate to your plunge attacks on your teams. The amount is a little bit hard to tell because translation is kind of, it's 4, 6, 8, or 10% per enemy hit, basically, right? So 4% with one enemy, 6% with 2, 8% with 3, 10% with 4, but it's unclear whether if you hit the same enemy with 2 separate hits, right? Every time, because you get a hit from the coordinated attack every time you plunge. It's unclear if you hit the same enemy twice, if it counts as 2 stacks. I don't think so, but it might be, I don't know. From what I've looked at, I've expected it not to work that way, and that you only get 4% in single target, but that is a possibility. I mean, that's cool, but it's still not that big of a deal. But her Ascension 4 is where the shit is at. When the Star Waker created by stars gather at dusk, her elemental burst, has Adeptal Assistance stack, so basically, for the first 8 plunge attacks you do after her burst, nearby active characters' plunge attacks shockwave damage will be increased by 180% of Xianyun's attack. That's a lot. That's a big number. That's like, if we were to compare it to similar hits, or to similar abilities, Shenhe's Icy Quill increases by about 80% of her attack. And you can get 5 or 7, depending on which mode of E you use. Per rotation, you can get up to 10. These you can get up to 8, and they're 180%. That's good. It technically has a maximum damage increase, but you're not gonna reach that without signature, and I think even with signature, you need like incredibly high artifact quality to actually reach that limit. The cap doesn't matter. The quote-unquote downside of this is that this additional damage only applies to 1 enemy per plunge attack. So it's a single target thing. It is hard for me to properly stress enough how big of a number this is. And I'm not saying that to say like, wow, she's incredibly broken because she has a big number. It's just specifically her Ascension 4 is a very, very large part of her kit. This 180 motion value that you get is huge. Hello, this is Zajef from a few days after recording a pre-release. She got what seems to be her final changes in the beta, and her Ascension 4 passive got slightly buffed. It was increased from 180% of her attack to 200% of her attack, and her healing got slightly shifted. The initial healing is a bit lower, and the healing over time is a bit higher. And finally, her triple E damage has been increased. I think overall, the triple E damage increase doesn't really matter because I still don't think it's worth in most of her teams to do the triple E, unless you just have time to waste in your rotation, which I don't think her teams tend to have. The healing changes don't matter too much. It'll mean that it takes a little bit longer to stack up Fanfare if you're playing with Farina, but it's not a huge deal because the amount of damage that you gain from the Ascension 4 buff is a little bit more than what you lose from not getting that Fanfare as early. So overall, slight buff. I don't think it's enough to realistically change much of my thoughts on any of her teams. At the end of the day, a lot of what she provides is the ability to do plunges, not just the damage she provides from those plunges. So about 10% buff to that damage she's providing is not a 10% buff to your damage in your plunges. It's closer to like 4 to 5%, often a lot less, right? Especially when you're playing with Bennett. Overall, it's a nice little buff. It doesn't really change any of my thoughts on her overall, but yeah, okay-ish business. So what you end up with this character is a plunge buffer and plunge enabler that lets any character basically become like Xiao and trigger some plunges. How good are plunge attacks? Well, the thing is, characters have different plunge attack multipliers. Most sword characters, this is the talent value, the motion value at level 1. Most characters have the same, and usually a few characters have an exception because their kit actually works with plunge attacks or for some other reason. So basically, every sword character except Kazuha has the same plunge attack multiplier, and Kazuha has one that is a bit higher. Every polearm has the same, except Hu Tao, that's ever so slightly higher, but about the same. And then Xiao, which is higher. Most Claymore characters are the same, but Ito, Razor, and Diluc have higher, with Diluc being the highest in the game. Every single Catalyst is the same, and every single bow user except Child, for some reason, is the same. That doesn't mean that they'll all do the same amount of damage. So there's a few factors that go into what makes a good or bad plunge character. Well, yeah, also Jimenez Constellation 3 increases his normal attack talent level, which will also obviously increase the multiplier. But the first thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the animations. I want to look at a polearm character, a claymore character, a sword character, and a catalyst character. If I just try to spam plunge attacks, you have to go through, right? Like you have to go through the whole plunge animation before you can jump again, which makes your plunges relatively slow. That plunge animation is different based on what weapon type you have. It's a bit longer for claymore characters. For sword characters, it's kind of a little bit shorter. And for catalyst characters, it's also a little bit shorter, but not like instant. However, you can dash cancel this end lag to your plunge animation. Instead of plunging at this speed, oops, you can do it this speed. However, polearm characters can't actually dash cancel the end lag of their plunge attack. So they can't do that, but they can do something else, which is they can normal attack cancel the end of that end lag, and then they can cancel that normal attack and do something like this. Right, which is faster than if I'm just spamming the jump button, because I'm canceling the end lag with a normal attack. Even if I don't actually let the normal attack go through. And I'm trying to not let it go through, but I'm not playing very well, so it is what it is. There's obviously some characters that have slightly different animations, but as a general rule, this is what you have. One thing that you might notice is that this number, right, this base number, is actually a decent amount higher for Claymore characters than it is for other characters. But Claymore characters aren't any slower at doing plunge attacks than other characters. So Claymore characters kind of just have an inherent advantage. And then another advantage that Claymores have is this. I don't know if you guys are seeing this additional number I'm getting, which is very, very easy to get with Claymores. I'm getting 874 and 1007 there, right? Which is a bit harder to get on other weapon types because the hitbox is just smaller. I got it there. I didn't get it there. I got it there. I got it there. I got it there. I got it there. Cause like I'm not like at the perfect angle. But as soon as I'm not at the perfect angle anymore, I stop getting this second hit, right? That is the plunge damage. This number, which is different from the low and high plunge damage. Effectively, you have a collision plunge multiplier, which happens if you hit enemies while you're falling for your plunge attack. And then you have an explosion plunge multiplier, which happens when you land. It does an explosion around where you land. And the hitbox for that collision plunge is very, very generous for these Claymore characters. This makes it so that Claymore characters get a lot more advantages out of being able to do plunges than non-Claymore characters. Does that mean that Claymore characters are the only ones that care about it? No. At the end of the day, as much as being a Claymore character gives you some advantages, character's kit can also give you advantages. What sort of character kit is good with Xianyun? Well, realistically, it's one of two things. You have a character who's buffing themselves a lot and who can therefore take better advantage of Xianyun's buff and have plunges that are actually doing a lot of damage because they're not balanced around them being able to plunge. They're balanced around what their usual combos usually are. So characters that don't have the best motion value on their usual stuff. That's the first type. The second type is characters that already implement jump cancels in their combos. Because the difference in time between doing a jump up until you land and doing an enhanced jump and a plunge attack isn't actually that much. Whereas the difference in damage between getting a plunge attack and not getting a plunge attack is pretty big. So an example of the first type would be a character like Diluc is a good example of the second type, right? Which is just Diluc's elemental skill and elemental burst are not very good. But as we've seen, Diluc has the highest plunge multiplier in the game. Until level 9, it's over 400, 411. Until level 10, it's 442. On top of that, he's a Claymore character, which means that he can very easily get that collision plunge, and also just has a fairly large AoE on his plunge attack hitbox. And so what you can do is you can build a team around Diluc vaping his plunge attacks, where you just do something like this and get a bunch of vapes. If I actually try to showcase the damage, which obviously won't be perfect because Cloud Retainer herself will, or Xianyun herself does increase your damage by a pretty large amount. So the plunge damage will not be nearly as high as it's quote unquote supposed to be, but I can still give you a sneak peek into how a team like this works. Okay, business. All right, so I'm getting nice little 83, 86-ish K on those plunges, and I'm dead. So obviously this damage would be higher if we're actually getting Cloud Retainer. For context, I want to very quickly show you guys how much my Diluc hits in this same team if I don't do plunges. And also keep in mind I'm not getting as many Farina stacks as I should because Bennett doesn't heal the whole team whereas Xianyun does, right? But I'm dumb. I'm dumb, aren't I? Because it's gonna shield back up, isn't it? Whatever. Alright, but like my burst hits for about 100k, well 80k. My E hits for about 40k, right? Anyways, that's one of the things that you can do with Xianyun. How good is doing something like that? After looking at the numbers, I'd say it's alright. I don't think it's like insane, wow, amazing. But it is good enough that like you can clear with it. And one of the nice advantages of it is that it is even good enough to clear with it with a lot of bad fucking characters. You can use characters like Femine, you can use characters, even characters that don't have synergy, just if they're a melee character that can take advantage of Bennett's Constellation 6 to Pyro Infuse, they can work. And it can actually be enough damage to reach the DPS checks to 36 star, which is really cool. That's a nice thing for her. Another thing that you can do is use characters like Hu Tao that already implement jump cancels in their combos. If I do a usual Hu Tao combo, so I am not a perfect Hu Tao player, right? So take the gameplay you're gonna see with a little grain of salt. But usually with Hu Tao, you can either do N1C or you can do N2C. And generally N2C is slightly better for a multitude of reasons, but generally N2C is slightly better. So if you're doing N2C, how many can you get? Generally, if you're doing well with jump cancels, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? You can get up to 8. I actually got that first try, Pog. Okay, so you can get up to 8. I think technically it's possible to do 9 if you're fucking machine input whatever, but 8. You can get up to 8. If you have Constellation 1, then you can do dash cancels and that can let you weave in a couple more, up to about 10. If, on the other hand, you have a jump buff and you do plunge attacks with the same combo, the same N2C jump, but you just do plunge attacks now, what do you get? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can get up to 5. I've never managed to do another full N2C jump plunge, but I have managed to get another N2C at the very least. And that tells me that there's enough wiggle room that I think 5 N2C is a reasonable combo to look at. 5 N2C JP. So, without looking at what you get from Cloud Retainer herself, without looking at the Xianyun damage on the Ascension 4, how much damage are you getting just from Hu Tao on these combos? So before looking at any reactions, this new N2C JP is almost as good as Hu Tao's C1. If you're looking at reactions, N1 and N2 being able of not vaping, so you need unvaped, N2 unvaped, which are the same multipliers kinda, but then the rest times 1.5 because it's vaped, and then you're gonna have some elemental mastery. For now, we're gonna assume about 300 EM, and you're gonna see once we get into stuff later on that it can even be a lot more than that with Xianyun in Hu Tao teams. But yeah, so as you can see, it's a little bit behind the C1, but it's not too far behind. And once you start taking into account the additional damage you can get from Xianyun, it will be better. If we collapse everything except the results, this is what we end up with. If you are going to be playing a team where what I've looked at here is Hu Tao, Farina, Xingqiu, and then your last slot being an Animo healer. This 8 and 2 CJ, we can also call this C0 Hu Tao plus Jean. This 10 and 2 CD, we can call this C1 Hu Tao plus Jean. And this 8 and 2 CJP, we can call this C0 Hu Tao plus Xianyun. And hopefully this illustrates the point I am trying to make with Hu Tao. When you're looking at the pre-existing Hu Tao teams that can run Jean, if you were to replace Jean with Xianyun, it will be a pretty significant increase. And on top of that, it's going to be an increase that makes Hu Tao's C1 kind of irrelevant, because this combo doesn't use dashes. You don't need the stamina. You get more damage jump canceling than you get dash canceling because of that plunge damage that you're getting. Now, obviously, there's a few caveats to that. Number one, this is with Xingqiu, right? Which makes it very easy to maintain the Hydro Aura. With Yelan, it's a little bit harder to maintain that aura, and you're going to lose out on some vapes. If we edit this sheet and make it so that you miss your vape on 3 out of the 5 plunges, then it's still almost as good as if you were to be playing with C1 without those plunges. I think it's very unlikely that you're gonna miss your vapes on more plunges than you hit them. And as soon as you start getting your vapes on over half of them, then it's higher. I think that with Yelan, it is possible that you miss some, but I don't think you'll miss over half. So I still think that it is better than the alternatives when you want to be playing those teams with Jean. How good are those teams with Jean to begin with? I've talked when I covered Farina about how I wasn't a big fan of the double Hydro teams for Hu Tao with Farina. And the main reason for that is because I struggled to see a significant enough upside to really justify using your double Hydro on her when she was so good already without needing it in the VV Vape teams, which are harder to play, so there is that upside there. But if you're willing to learn your combos, it was a bit more difficult for me to really see that upside. I think that with Xianyun's release, that upside is large enough for those teams to really be worth playing. But I do want to clarify that the teams aren't worth playing already with Jean. They're good teams. Just because I'm not a huge fan of them and I don't think that they're necessarily the best Hu Tao teams doesn't mean they're bad. They're already good Hu Tao teams, and with Xianyun, they'll just be better. Overall, I think that Hu Tao is one of the biggest winners from Xianyun's release, where she just gets a bunch of free damage, and because you can dash by jumping. There's a lot of attacks that only have hitboxes on the ground and that are going to be pretty easy to dodge just from doing your combos. Whereas your normal jump isn't high enough to dodge it, your enhanced jump will be. So that's that team. But this is not a Hu Tao pre-release, it's a Xianyun pre-release. So we gotta move on to the other ones. And again, right, you might be thinking that we've been on this for a while, and we're not even into the sheet that I usually make in my pre-releases, the weapons and all that. That's because we have a lot to cover. Because this character has a lot of different teams. And I guess that's the first misconception that I've seen going on about her, which is that because she's a plunge character, a plunge buffer, then that makes her niche. And I understand why people feel that way, but I don't think they'll feel that way after they've actually tested her. It feels like a niche because right now only one character can do plunges, but her release will expand that niche so much that it's hard for me to call it a niche. Out of the characters that are already released, which ones are going to be able to work well with her? Xiao, obviously. Noelle, to some extent. Yai, Sino, and Kutsing, to some extent. Diluc, Bennett, Daya, to some extent. I'm coping a little bit with Daya, but I don't care. And then Ayaka, to some extent, and Risley as well. So, and yeah, obviously Hu Tao that I've already explained. Now, the extent to which she will work with those characters, it will depend. But that's only the characters that will work well with the plunge buff. And on top of that, she's also an animal healing that can do a similar job to Jean in any Farina team that wants Jean right now. Any of those quick bloom teams that use Farina, but I guess those ones don't really use Jean too much. Any of those freeze teams that use Farina, any of those mono hydro or electro teams that use Farina, they now have one additional option for a healer. On top of that, in the same patch that she's getting released, we're getting Gaming, who is also a plunge-focused character, and who will work quite well with her. I'm not going to go too into detail in terms of how well he works with her, because I'll be making a dedicated Gaming pre-release. But for now, what you need to know is his E gives him a special plunge attack every time he uses it, and his E's cooldown gets reset every few seconds when he's in his burst. So he gets basically special plunge attacks when he's in his burst, and he works pretty well with Xianyun. And like, that's kind of a lot of different teams where she can work out fairly well. And it's hard for me to call that niche when you look at characters like Kokomi, for example, which I think almost everyone would agree is pretty versatile. And you see that really she works well in Mono Hydro, in Taser, in Freeze, in Bloom. And those different team archetypes, right? The Bloom team is only a Nilo team, right? So there's no real variation to that. And on top of that, she's replaceable. A lot of other units can do a similar job, sometimes worse, sometimes better, like Barbara and Ayato. In the Freeze team, she tends to be one of the better options, but with Furina's release, Freeze teams also very much like using Furina instead of a Hydro healer and then slotting in either a Cryo or an Animal healer, like Xianyun. In Taser teams, again, she's pretty replaceable. While she can be good and she has some good Taser teams, she is very replaceable in those teams. And I'd say in Mono Hydro, it's probably the main teams where like there is much more of an incentive for her, because there's not really a great third Hydro unit that is synergistic with Xingqiu and Yelan, or that is synergistic with with Furina. I mean, I guess you can still just play Xingqiu, Yelan, Furina though, with an Animal healer, and that's still great. So again, right, even then it's like, yeah, you can probably argue that she's the best, but you got other options, and those other options often like to use Xianyun. And I'm not saying this to say Xianyun is more versatile than Kokomi. I'm just trying to contextualize the idea that like plunge is niche, which like I just don't really think it is. I don't think it, at least I don't think it's as narrow a niche as people are making it out to be. I think a lot more characters than you expect are able to work with it. And I really do mean a lot. Because next I want to talk about Yunjin. Now you might be thinking, what the fuck are you, what are you yapping about, Zajef? Why Yunjin? And I chose Yunjin because she has all of the characteristics that should make her dog shit with Xianyun. She's a polearm character, which means that she can't dash cancel her plunge attacks, which means that she'll inherently get less plunge attacks. She has nothing in her kit that is really useful to increase her plunge damage. No real buffs to herself other than a defense buff, which doesn't apply to her plunges. She isn't Hydro or Pyro, which could help generate some energy for the rest of your team. Her own energy generation as geoparticles is low. Really, it's hard to be less synergistic with Xianyun than Yunjin is. And I took Yunjin and I looked at the sort of results you should be able to expect in a team where you use Yunjin, Furina, Bennett C6, and Xianyun. And obviously it wasn't good, but it was surprisingly decent. Good enough to 36-star decent. And while yes, it is fair to say that the supports are doing the heavy lifting in a team like that, I think that it's inherently a bit different than if you were to slap any unit with Raiden, Nahida, Xingqiu. Because as much as it is the supports doing the heavy lifting, the majority of the team's damage is coming from your on-fielder. It is coming from Yunjin, even if she's not, like, even if any character could be really doing it. And that's one of the main takeaways that I want people to have from this video, is that if you have, and I know that's potentially a big if, because that's not the case for everyone, right? But if you have Bennett C6 and Furina, Xianyun can make any dogshit character that you really like, but that just isn't really good in any of the teams you play, have a team where they can potentially clear Abyss in time as a carry on field. But only the ones that can be infused by Bennett, so polearm, swords, and claymores. But the thing is, as much as that is almost kind of meme, to me that's still something that I think is very relevant, because I know how many people have a favorite character that they wish, or that they force on field, right? Even if they don't have a good team where they're on field, just because they like the character and they want to see more of him. And I think that for those players, a character like Xianyun can be very, very significant. And that's why I'm bringing it up in the pre-release. The last two things I want to mention before I get into the usual stuff is Raiden and Bennett. So first, Raiden, again, Xianyun's wording is ambiguous because there's no other buffing character that has the same wording as her, which means that there is no precedent that they need to stay consistent with, which means that it could go either way. On top of that, even when there is precedent, that doesn't mean shit to Hoyo. Because again, this fucking shit is worded the same way as Beidou, and this shit works, but Beidou doesn't. So even when things are worded the same way, it doesn't mean they'll necessarily actually work the same way. What that means is you should not assume that it will work. It is a possibility that it will work, but you should not assume it, because you'll get fucked. I don't expect it to work. I think it should. I think it would be cool if it did, but I don't expect it to work, and I don't think you should either. If it does work, that'll be a nice surprise, but it probably won't. Does that mean that Xianyun is unplayable with Raiden? Unironically, no. Xianyun will still be playable with Raiden because Raiden's plunge combos are slightly better than her non-plunge combos. That being said, you are using a slot that could instead be used by a character that gives you something else, like Kazuha, for example, could be giving you a lot more personal damage than Xianyun, on top of a bigger buff. So is it going to be better than her current best options? I don't believe so. But is it going to be an option, for example, when you're playing her in a Farina team where you need a healer? Yeah, it's going to be an option. And arguably better than Jean, because as much as it is very likely that Raiden won't be able to use Xianyun's Ascension 4, just doing plunge attacks, having the option to do plunge attacks is nice. And then finally, I want to talk about Bennett. Now, it should come as no surprise to longtime viewers of this channel that I like Bennett a lot, but it may be a surprise to some of you guys that Bennett is a really good fucking carry. Now, the reason for that isn't because he has the best carry numbers. It's because you'd have to have Bennett on your team anyways if you were playing a different carry that is an attack scaler like he is. And when your carry is Bennett himself, you effectively free up the slot that would otherwise want to be used by Bennett for one additional support. Bennett's biggest downside as a carry is that his normal attacks are pretty dog shit. This ain't great. His biggest upside as a carry is that his E is pretty good. When you are using Xianyun, you'll be able to do, and don't look at the damage, I'm pretty sure he's on fucking instructor right now. You'll be able to alternate between using your normal attack and using your E. Or sorry, using your plunge attack and using your E. And do something like this. Obviously, you'd have Cloud Retainer instead of Zhongli. But what this lets you do is it lets you play a infused character with like Bennett C6 as your carry that not only actually has good synergy with Xianyun, because Bennett as a carry wants to have something to do between his E cooldowns of 2 seconds, and the plunge attack lines up perfectly for that. But also, it lets you use a character like Xingqiu or Yilan as a last option. And I've done some napkin preliminary calcs on it, and obviously, right, you should always take things like this with a grain of salt, because pre-release stuff is we're always working off of a lot of assumptions. But from what I've seen, it's looking like it might be Cloud Retainer's best team. And at the very least, it definitely will be one of Cloud Retainer's best teams. And I like that because I like playing Bennett carry. Right, like obviously, like I said, right, he's on instructor right now, so you can't trust the damage you saw. But like, if I just put him on Maréchaussée, right, just very quickly show what you can get right now out of him before even getting the plunge buff from Cloud Retainer. As you can see, it's not like the most crazy damage, but you have to keep in mind that I'm also getting all the damage from Xingqiu. And the damage is still pretty good. And then you take into account the fact that, well, I'm not really getting a lot of Farina stacks because Xianyun is not there to heal my team. And the fact that, well, I'm not getting the fucking plunge buff from Xianyun. And you realize, oh yeah, this is actually kind of pretty damn fucking good, isn't it? Oh. So that is the second team I wanted to talk about. Or the second thing. The last thing I wanted to talk about before getting into the usual stuff. So, now, let's talk about her constellations. So, her constellation 1 is one more charge on her skill. Now, this is a kind of a difficult one to evaluate because it is good because you get to generate 5 more particles, right? And they changed her in the last iteration of the beta to always generate 5 particles, whether you do 1 E or 3 E's. So you can just do 1 E plunge twice, and it generates 10 particles. That's a lot of fucking particles, right? Like, that's really nice. But it's a 12-second cooldown, which means you can't really do 2 per rotation. You can still get quote-unquote 2 per rotation if you're doing either long rotations or if you're just killing the enemies in 1.5 rotation. And this can always just be more comfort, because it lets you just generate more energy in a lot of situations. But yeah, overall it's all right. It is what it is. It's not the greatest, and it's definitely not as good as her signature. C2, after using a sky ladder after using her skill, her attack will be increased by 20%. Additionally, the effect of her A4 will be increased, so it basically doubles her A4 damage, which is pretty good. C3 is her burst. C3 is incredibly bad, and so is C5, by the way. Just dog shit fucking cons. C4, after using your E, you heal all party members based on how many times you E'd for your plunge, right? So 50, 80, 150. Anyway, and then finally, you have her C6. After Skyladder has been used 1, 2, 3 times, so after basically based on how many times you use your E, you gain crit damage on your E. And if you use your skill during your burst, you will get the damage bonus, and it won't go on cooldown. So basically, you become Xiao. It's pretty good. If you really want to play her as a carry, it's obviously pretty good. And I guess actually, I haven't talked about how she is as a carry in general. Honestly, she's all right as a carry in general. If you have C6 Farazan, Bennett, Farina, right, you can play her as a carry, and it's pretty all right. It is what it is. Like, it is actually playable. It's not great, but it is playable. And then obviously at C6, it's pretty good. It doesn't make her better at what she usually does outside of the C6, but it does let you play her as a carry and make that a lot better. But yeah, I think the Constellations are fairly unremarkable. Like, the C2 is good and all, but eh. She's one of the few characters where I kind of like the signature weapon more than going for cons, mainly because the C1's not that great. No, the C2 is good. I don't know. I feel like the weapon basically gives you the C1 and the C2 both at the same time. It depends on how much damage your character's plunge, like, base motion value is doing, but and you can kind of go for either. But yeah. Anyways, if she shares a banner with a character that has a good signature 5-star, then it might be a pretty good weapon banner. And it's rare that I fucking say that, but hopefully, preach. Anyways, let's get back to it. As usual, we have weapons, and this is fairly interesting and a little bit sad, unfortunately, because I think that her, like, default option is going to be the Oathsworn Eye, which is an event weapon that a lot of people didn't get, right? Either because they weren't playing at the time, took a break, whatever, right? And this is the weapon that I've been assuming for most of my counts. The weapons that you have available to you, generally, obviously, her best in slot, the Crane's Echoing Call. It gives you highest base attack, attack percent substat, plunge damage to nearby party members, and energy generation on plunges, or on party member plunges. It's basically everything that she needs. To me, this is them learning from the mistakes they made with Calamity Queller, of it just being fucking worse than Fav in most situations because it doesn't give any energy. They learned from that, and they didn't make the same mistake again, and they made her signature give energy, and it is actually a pretty good signature. I think it's kind of rare for support weapons to actually offer a sizable team DPS increase, and this weapon does do that, so it's something that you can definitely consider if you want to go for vertical investment. I definitely won't be going for it, but it's definitely better than Calamity Queller, right? It is an increase for your team DPS over any other option, and like, it's an actual relevant increase to your team DPS, so it's pretty good. Next, other 5-star stat sticks, which I'm just gonna have Scoured Atlas here for now because that's really the only one, right? The other stat sticks give you fucking crit or HP or shit you don't want, right? Because her personal damage is kind of a joke. What she cares about is attack to make her buff bigger, like Xianyun. And Scoured Atlas is very meh, because, yeah, I guess you could also look at Memory of Dust as well, right? But the same thing for Memory of Dust. These options are very underwhelming because of how good Oathsworn Eye is, and because of how good TDDS is. Moving on to Oathsworn Eye. Oathsworn Eye, it's an event weapon, so not everyone has it, which is why we also have some other options, right? It's high base attack, attack substat, gives you 48% ER in your passive. It is not for the whole rotation, it's only for 10 seconds, but most of your energy is generated during these 10 seconds because obviously you generate your animal particles right after using her skill, so you'll have this energy recharge for at least the more important part of your rotation. But obviously, this event was only available now, what is now a pretty long time ago, and so other options are important to talk about. This is the default free-to-play weapon, basically, and the best one-to-one replacement you can have is Prototype Amber. Now, Prototype Amber gives you energy restoration when you use it, or when you use your burst. That is more or less interchangeable with the ER that you get directly from Hu Tao, but it's an HP substat weapon rather than attack substat, which is obviously not as good for an attack scaler. That being said, when you're playing her with Farina, Prototype Amber helps you stack up Fanfare faster into your rotation, which makes it so that the damage loss is actually fairly minor, and it makes it so that Prototype Amber is actually just about as good as Hu Tao. I would just use whichever one you have available to you. They're fairly interchangeable. Hu Tao is nice if you don't want to have to use your prototypes for this, or if you're already using it on Neuvillette or something like that. This is nice if you didn't fucking play during the event and don't have an Hu Tao. But they're both pretty good. And then you have TTDS and Fav. So Fav, obviously, the purpose of Fav is to generate more energy for both her and for the rest of her team. There are some teams where you'll really appreciate going Fav because you need the energy generation. But the reality is her buff, in terms of how well it scales directly with attack, is much bigger than Shenhe's buff. Shenhe's buff, like the quill buff, is only part of the damage increase that she provides, with another significant part of the damage increase she provides being from her Ascension 4 passive, which gives her skill burst or normal charge plunge attack damage, her Ascension 1 passive, which gives her cryo damage, or which gives your team cryo damage, and her burst, which reduces resistance. And so while the quills are obviously useful, building more attack on her isn't necessarily as valuable, because a lot of the rest of her buffs is not reliant on how much attack she has. What that means is it's a lot easier to get away with crit rate substats for Fav. On top of that, with Cryo Resonance, you get another 15% crit rate for Fav, basically for free. And you basically don't play Shenhe without Cryo Resonance. Xianyun, on the other hand, doesn't have either of those things, right? Her buff is a lot more reliant on her own attack, and more importantly, she doesn't have that Cryo Resonance. She just has less ways of reliably building crit rate without sacrificing a lot of attack. This makes it so that Fav is unfortunately not quite as good on her as it is on some other supports. It is still a very viable option, especially if the rest of your team needs the energy, but I would generally not really use it over the other two options that we've already mentioned. And then finally, we have TTDS, which is very hard to rank because it's either her second best option behind her signature or pretty bad. The thing about TTDS is the 48% attack you get from it is huge. And it's generally more than the damage you get from having higher attack with a weapon like Scoured Atlas. However, it doesn't give you any ER, and a lot of her teams will leave you in situations where you need a lot of ER on her. If you can reach your ER requirements with TTDS, TTDS is a good weapon for her. If you can't, you're gonna need to use Ultranai or Proto Amber or Fav Codex. This leaves my ranking as follows. I would say that generally, her signature is always her best weapon. Then TTDS is best in slot, free to play, with an asterisk, only when you can reach the ER requirements, and obviously your rotation allows for you to give your TTDS to your carry, which some rotations don't. Then Ultranai and Proto Amber, then Fav Codex, and then Scoured Atlas. And the main reason why Scoured Atlas is so low, and right in the same breath, Memory of Dust, is because you're better off if you can reach your ER requirements that you don't need an ER weapon. There are very, very few teams that would rather use Scoured Atlas over TTDS. Okay, well, I've talked about those ER requirements a lot, but how much actually are they? Let's talk about that. So you get 3 energy when you catch an animal particle, 1.8 when a different character does, 1 energy when you catch a non-animal particle, 0.6 when another character does, 2 when you catch a clear particle, 1.2 when another character does. Now let's take a look at what her ER requirements can look at in the general case scenario, the worst case scenario, and the best case scenario. The best case scenario is probably going to be a Xiao team where you use her along with Farazan C6 because you're generating a lot of animal particles. What are you getting? You're getting 5 particles from her that you're funneling into her. always. What is it? 6 particles, I think, from Xiao, and then 6 particles from Farazan. Top of that, you're getting the particles from Farina, who is probably going to be on Fab in this team because she's so low hydro, and you're not generating the biggest amount of particles. It's just their animal particles, which makes it easy for Cloud Retainer. Maybe Xianyun catches 1 and doesn't catch 7, and you have Farazan on Fav and Farina on Fav, which gets you energy, cost, ER. Right? In the best case scenario, her ER requirements can be as low as around 140, 130, 140. That's good. That is effectively reachable through substats alone without even needing a weapon that gives you ER. So in a team like this, you could very easily get away with TTDS on her. But that is the best case scenario. There's other case scenarios. The average case scenario, I'd say, is probably the Bennett carry team that I mentioned, or maybe the Hu Tao team. Maybe the Hu Tao team is a better example. So we're gonna look at Hu Tao, Xianyun. All right, so this is Xiao, Farazan, Farina. Next, we can look at Hu Tao, Xingtou, Farina. Still catching 5, but 0 non-animo. Different element. You're getting Hu Tao, which is 4 to 6, and it's on average, I think, I don't remember what the average is. Hu Tao, it's 4.8, right? Yeah, 4.8 average. Isn't she 80 cost? I don't think so, but maybe I'm dumb. No, she's 70. Okay, you're maybe catching 1 of Farina's particles, then not catching 7, then Xingtou 5, and then Hu Tao 4.8. Clear caught 0, clear non-caught. This is not a team where you necessarily need to have anyone on Fav because you have double hydro to like alleviate Xingtou and Farina's ER requirements. And we are looking at the worst case, so let's assume that you don't have any of them on Fav. Is that to give us a this is the average case, sorry. Okay, let's assume one of them is on Fav then, and then your ER requirements at around or somewhere around 220, which is technically reachable with an ER sends plus ER substats. Without an ER weapon, you'd get a little bit over 50 from the sends, which means that you would need about 70 from the rest, which is a little bit under 20% ER per piece, which is a lot. It's a lot, but it is technically reachable with good investment and the right pieces. But I think in most situations, you're gonna run an ER weapon. And then finally, worst case scenario is when you're playing a random ass character like Yunjin in the Yunjin C6 Bennett Farina. So Yunjin, Bennett, Farina, still getting 5 of her own. That's never changing. Farina still getting 1. You're getting 7 off field. Then you get Bennett, hard to fit more than 1 E. Let's do 2. And then Yunjin. And without Fav, your ER requirements are at around 265, which is hard to reach even with an ER weapon. So you would really want to go for a Fav weapon, which makes this a bit more reachable, but very, very hard to reach without an ER weapon. And a lot of that is because the Farina just generates a decently high amount of particles, and I think that there's no team where you really would want to play her that both doesn't generate a lot of particles through your other characters and doesn't run Farina. And that's actually one thing that I guess it leads me into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is I think that Xianyun does have one glaring weakness, and it's that she is significantly weaker if you don't have Farina. I think that almost all of her good teams use Farina, and if you don't have Farina, I don't think that she's all that valuable to get. Like, there are a few exceptions. There are teams that are all right with her that don't have Farina. There are even some teams that are good with her without Farina, but there's not too many. I mean, mainly you can look forward to high constellation gumming teams with high constellation gumming melt teams can do well with her without Farina. Just potentially some like Diluc Ayaka speedrunning bullshit might be all right without Farina. But overall, it's just meh. I mean, you also have, I guess, like the Rev Melt stuff where you can use Xianyun or Ayaka, but also not the greatest. I really do think that most of her good teams really like using Farina, and so keep that in mind for your decision on whether or not you want to roll for her. That when I'm talking about like the things that she can do well and all that, I'm kind of assuming you have Farina. Anyways, now that we've looked at the ER requirements, let's get back into this. Moving on to artifact sets. And this is interesting. As a general rule, Vivi. In almost every team, Vivi is her best in slot. Even when you're looking at the Xiao team that we looked at here, right? Xiao, Farazan, Farina. Because Farina's in the team and Farina does non-insignificant damage, Vivi is kind of just her best option. You could have Vivi on someone else, and that could also work. But I think that generally, in this team, you're gonna swap from Xianyun to Xiao. Xianyun is the last character you swap into before you swap to Xiao, which means that she's the one that's going to give you the best Vivi uptime for your Farina. Unless, obviously, you want to put Vivi on Xiao himself, but I think that most people would not want to do that. Especially in a team that's like Hyper Gary Xiao. It's probably not the greatest idea. But yeah, so in basically almost every single team, you're gonna want to be using Vivi. If either you are doing a rotation that doesn't let you get the VV on the element you want, or you're playing a team that really doesn't care about VV, like for example, a similar team like this where you don't have Farina, so you use Bennett instead, right? Where you do Xiao, Farazan, Bennett, Xianyun. If that's what's happening, then her second best artifact set is going to be the new healer set, Song of Days Past. And if you haven't farmed a Song of Days Past yet, you can use Noblesse or even Clam, and then 2v2vs if you really don't have any other options. But I really do think that as a general rule, she is a VV user. Next, artifact stats generally is going to be either attack, 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 or ER attack, attack. You don't really ever want to go for damage goblet because, again, her personal damage is fairly low, and the damage that you get from attack on her is pretty good. And there's nothing you'd want instead of ER or attack here. But for your circlet, you can justify a healing bonus circlet. It gives you, obviously, better healing, so more fanfare, and also just more healing, which can be more comfortable. But you don't really need it for your fanfare. Attack also increases your healing, albeit not by quite as much, and attack increases your damage. So I'd say that attack is still generally the better option, but healing bonus circlet is fine. Yeah, I guess also crit rate circlet can be fine if you're using Fav Codex, but again, only if you need the ER. And then finally, we get into the teams. Like I said earlier, there's going to be a bunch of them. The most obvious one is obviously the Xiao one, right? That I actually haven't talked about too much yet. She's good for Xiao teams. It's a nice increase for Xiao in single target scenarios. It's not necessarily an upgrade in AoE because her additional damage on plunge attacks only triggers on one target, but it's very rare that you're in situations where you have multiple targets that are all as tanky as one another. Usually, you have one that's tankier, so it only proccing on one enemy isn't really that big of a deal, because you'll kill the other enemies with Xiao's basic AoE anyways. So I think in most situations, it's not even that big of a downside for Xiao that her personal damage or her personal buff only applies to one enemy. Very pog. She is a nice healing option that doesn't force you to stay inside of a circle, unlike Bennett. That's pretty nice. And yeah, she's just pretty good with Xiao. One interesting thing about this though is the motion value that you get from her is obviously attack scaling, but with her attack, not Xiao's attack. However, it does scale with Xiao's crit rate and damage percent, which means that sets that give you attack percent tend to lose a little bit in value when you're playing her, as opposed to set that give you other stats. Which means, Vermilion Havers, I'm sorry, but yeah. This ain't looking too hot for you guys. Shout out to Ziox. True. But yeah. Bennett carry, great. Hu Tao, double Hydro, right? I guess I'll just say good. I'll just call them good. Hu Tao, VV, right? So VV Vape Hu Tao, which is one Hydro. It's fine. It'll work in a team like this. It's a bit harder for me to really see the vision for it because her animations are relatively long. So you're going to potentially lose a decent amount of your uptime on your other buffs if you're using her. It should be fine, but it shouldn't be great. Basically, yeah, that's just Bennett instead of Farina, basically. It should work out fairly well, but I mean, you're losing on, like, Farina's Hydro application is actually relevant because Cloud Retainer's or Xianyun's coordinated attack is complete garbage, right? Like, you'd rather not have it. All it does is it weakens whatever aura you have, right? That's what it does. It does dog shit damage and it weakens your aura, which is bad. And you're not building her for EM, so the swirl isn't even good. This is just not good. But it does make it so that even with Sing So, you can start to struggle a little bit to maintain your application. So that's something to be on the lookout for. But it will be fine, assuming your auras do work. I'm just not entirely sure they will. Will the animal coordinated attacks mess up double Hydro Hu Tao Vapes in AoE situations? In AoE situations, they will help more than they hurt. In single target, it will hurt more than it helps. Okay, other teams, obviously... these are like the biggest ones. I guess Gumming, it's good with an asterisk, and if you want to know more about this, I will be posting a Gaming pre-release, so you can take a look at that. She can range from fine to actually pretty fucking good with Gaming, depending on what other things you have. Gaming's a character whose performance will vary a lot, like a huge fucking amount, based on the surrounding things you have. From my preliminary calcs, it seems like his performance can... you can basically more than triple his damage if you just have the right supports to work with him. And not just the right supports, but actually the right things for those supports as well. But again, watch that pre-release if you want more information on him. Next, anyways, Diluc is gonna be all right, and then C6 Bennett plus anyone is gonna be fine. And then what's left is basically the teams where you don't really care much for the plunge itself, but you care about getting an animal healer, and the plunge can be a nice benefit, right? So you have basically any of the aggravate teams, which are going to be pretty all right. And for context, it's like good, all right, fine. This is probably all right, actually, instead of fine. Aggravate teams, freeze teams, mono hydro, taser. And in these teams, it's not that she's incredibly synergistic, just that those teams are good with Jean, and therefore they will also be good with her. One of the things I haven't talked about yet is the ways in which jumping can help you dodge attacks. I mean, I talked about it a little bit for Hu Tao, but also when you're playing a character that doesn't really want to do plunge attacks, like if you're driving on Yelan on a mono hydro or a taser team, right? Sometimes there's attacks that are very scary and that can fucking do a lot of damage to you if they hit you and you don't iframe them well. Like, for example, Magu Kenki's, like, or Primo Bishops, or any other attacks like this that are like, you know, big damage attacks. And just having the opportunity to jump to dodge those can be nice, right? So that's another, like, thing that you're not going to see in her actual results that can help your quality of life. Other than this, I guess, I mean, what else? You could use her with like Noelle or Ito, but it's not really better than just having a more synergistic unit. So it's kind of Although I will say, specifically with Noelle, I think that it's kind of... If you're not a hyper invested Noelle, her shield can very often break fairly early, and then you just don't get any healing, so you don't stack any fanfare, and it just feels like shit. And so running an actual healer in the team isn't necessarily a terrible idea. I could see it being fine, but probably not the greatest. Xianyun or Ayaka, but just like Rev Melt, fine. You can use any of the... Or I guess you can use a character like Barbara to do plunge Barbara carry, and it'll be fine. Alright, with Xiangling. Like, it works out, but yeah. But yeah, so this effectively leaves her with a lot of different archetypes where she can be used. And that's why I personally find myself disagreeing very heavily with the perception that she's a niche character. I will say, a lot of the better teams tend to like it a lot when you have C6 Bennett. So that's something that may be enough to influence you to make that decision. But yeah, that's basically it for her. In terms of how good I think she is overall, honestly, I think she's pretty good. And again, right, I've talked about this in the Farina pre-release, and I'll have to talk about it again. I know that a lot of people have this like perception that when I call a unit all right, it means they're good. If I call a unit good, it means they're insane. If I call a unit bad, it means they're fine. And if I call a unit unplayable, it means they're bad. And like, that's fair when I'm talking about carries, because I think that for carries, the unit needs to be fucking outstanding to be good. Because you can only get 2 carries without fucking benching one, right? For supports, there's a lot more wiggle room, and so they don't need to be as good for them to be like useful and valuable for an account, right? So that special Zajef scale, it does not apply to when I'm talking about supports. What I mean when I say that I think that she's a pretty good support, that's what I mean. I don't mean she's insane WoW Omega broken. I mean she's pretty good. She does have some issues in terms of her reliance on some other characters. I think somewhat similarly, I think it's a bit similar to how a lot of the Sumeru 5 stars were a lot better if you had Nahida than if you didn't. I think that she is a lot better if you have Farina than if you don't. But that doesn't mean she's unplayable if you don't have Farina. It's just a lot less team options. Personally, I am definitely going to be getting her. I love playing Bennett carry, and I can't fucking wait for this shit. I've been playing a little bit of double vape Bennett with Xiangling recently. It's so fucking good, man. Bennett's just so good. I love playing Bennett. It's so fun. Anyways, I'm hyped for it. Also, yeah, I guess another thing that I forgot to mention, I think that it can be very difficult to get swirl for the intended element in a lot of teams if you don't have C6 Bennett. I'll talk about this more in the Gaming pre-release because he's a character that's very impacted by this, but some of the swirl setups are not really realistically doable, and so there are a bunch of teams where you'll just play her and not swirl your pyro if you're playing a pyro carry, and honestly she's still fine if that's the case. Like, she's still pretty good even when you're not swirling pyro. She's still all right. But yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed. And as usual, I'll be testing her on release. So again, this is only pre-release information. This is pre-release thoughts, pre-release analysis. It's in the fucking name. So I'm not as confident in my thoughts as I will be once I've actually tested her. So as usual, if you're relying on these to, you know, help you decide whether or not you want to pull, you should check out my day one testing on Twitch, twitch.tv/Zajef77, or wait for the post-release video. But that's gonna be it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.